Vitam aeternam, amen. Michael Francis Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
And all his works?
I do renounce them.
And all his pomps?
I do renounce them.
Michael Rizzi, will you be baptized?
I
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Michael Rizzi, go in peace, and may the Lord be with you. Amen.
As we examine our current conditions today as a people, one must ask, how did we get here as a collective? When we objectively take a look into what we perceive as history, we begin to see how far removed we are from our mighty ones of the past. Our struggles to find meaning in our day-to-day lives is rooted in our lack of understanding of our past. In order to build a brighter future for our people, we must first truly understand the fullness of our past so we can properly avoid some of the mistakes our ancestors made. One of those mistakes is the dissemination of falsified history. We believe that the powers that be have our best intentions at heart when it comes to our education. Every facet of our modern social makeup, from education to commerce to media, is held by a secret but blatantly visible cabal of people whose sole intention is to strip man of his knowledge of self. The truth of the matter is that today's time one must study to show themselves approved. We are in the age of Aquarius, or in the age of information, and with this comes the burden of sifting through low-quality information. What if I were to tell you that practically all of the nations of Earth are controlled by one singular group of people? Would the idea of a single group of people conquering all of the nations of old sound too tinfoil? As crazy or crackpot as this may sound, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that as recently as 200 years ago, our planet was usurped. Possibly after some untold worldwide cataclysmic event. The Greek philosopher Plato proposes the idea that there are 5 forms of regimes that govern man. At the top is an aristocracy, or symbolically, the kingdom of heaven on earth. In this form of government, wisdom and reason are the foundations and pillars of its structure. This is basically a utopia that is ran by a spiritual monarch. At the polar end of this form of rulership is a tyranny, a form of government that has unrestricted power. In this type of rulership, the ruler typically uses means of violence, persuasion, and manipulation to acquire this position. So the question is, where are we in this spectrum? Reading from Irish Wisdoms, written by Conor McDarry. It was conceived and put into effect by the ruling spirits at the head of the Roman Church and state of their day, who cherished the ambitious and far-reaching idea of nothing less than a universal rule for their church and empire. In the course of these pages, I will endeavor to explain and expose the conspiracy and the means by which those designing men who composed it advanced their project. And, with the aid of their successors, I propose to show, by persistent effort, brought the greater part of the Western world under their empire and church dominion, and brought this conspiracy to an almost complete success. It was the idea held by the leaders of the Roman Church and state. They were practically one. That all power should be centralized in the head of the church, who was also emperor of the state. And any and all religious institutions which in any way conflicted with this ideal were to be done away with. For this reason, the mystery cults were suppressed, and initiation into the ancient or esoteric mysteries were forbidden, so that no religious establishment, worship, or practice would exist which would draw and hold men to it other than the Roman state church. Unum Sanctum is a papal bull that was issued by Pope Boniface VIII on November 18, 1302. This decree can be said was the first of many in the imperialization of our planet. It laid down the dogmatic propositions on the unity of the Catholic Church, the necessity of belonging to it for eternal salvation, the position of the Pope as supreme head of the Church, and the duty thence arising of submission to the Pope to belong to the Church and thus to attain salvation. In celebration, he commissioned a gold-plated headdress in the shape of a pine cone, with an elaborate crown at its base. The pine cone is an ancient symbol of fertility and one traditionally associated with Baal, as well as the cult of Cybele. In short, everyone has to kiss the ring of the Pope. The Pope assigned himself as the Godfather and assigned the Jesuit order as his son Michael. In the last few lines of this bull, it reads, "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff." This was the first of many papal bulls or canon law that would be instituted by the Roman Pontiff in his conquest of all the known lands today. These bulls were administrative in nature and utilized terminology such as perpetual remembrance, which basically means forever. For an example, you have Roman Pontifex, issued in 1455. This also was the first testamentary trust. This papal bull was created to convey the right of use of any land as real property from the express trust Unum Sanctum, which we mentioned earlier, to the control of the pontiff and his successors in perpetuity. This simply means the Pope had rights to conquer any land and claim it as crown land. Sestakavi, a temporary testamentary trust, first created during the reign of Henry VIII of England through the Sestakavi Act of 1540, and updated by Charles II through the Sestakavi Act of 1666. The original purpose of a Sestakavi trust was to form a temporary estate for the benefit of another because some event, state of affairs, or condition prevented them from claiming their status as living, competent, and present before a competent authority. Another example is Aeterni Regis, or the Eternal Crown. This bull was issued by Pope Sixtus IV in 1481. This crown is represented by the second Sestakavi trust created when a child is born. This bull's function gives the private central bank of a nation the right to sell one's birth certificate as a bond. This essentially strips man of our God-given sovereignty and condemns him to perpetual servitude as a Roman citizen or slave. This papal bull created the crown of Aragon, later known as the crown of Spain, and is the highest sovereign and highest steward of all Roman slaves subject to the rule of the Roman pontiff. Spain lost the crown in 1604 when it was granted to King James I of England by Pope Paul V after the successful passage of the Union of Crowns, or Commonwealth, in 1605 after the false flag operation of the Gunpowder Plot. The crown was finally lost by England in 1975 when it was returned to Spain and Carlos I, where it remains to this day. The last of the three testamentary trusts was created in 1537 by Paul III through the papal bull Convocation. This bull was set up for the claiming of all lost souls, lost to the sea. The Venetians, more on them later, assisted in the creation of the first Sestakv Act of 1540 to use this papal bull as the basis of ecclesiastical authority of Henry VIII. This crown was secretly granted to England in the collection and reaping of lost souls. This crown was lost in 1816 due to the deliberate bankruptcy of England and granted to the Temple Bar, which became known as the Crown Bar, or simply the Crown. The Bar Association has since been responsible for administering the reaping of the souls of the lost and damned, including the registration and collection of baptismal certificates representing the souls collected by the Vatican and stored in its vaults. This third crown is represented by the third Sestakv Trust, created when a child is baptized. It is the parent's grant of the baptismal certificate, title to the soul, to the church or registrar. Thus, without legal title over one's soul, we will be denied legal standing and will be treated as things, cargo without souls, upon which the bar is now legally able to enforce maritime law. So, what does all this mean and why is it important? Simply put, by understanding the foundations of canon law, one is able to see the intentions of the Roman Catholic Church in a new light. The goal is to establish themselves as God on earth, making every living creature subject unto the vicar. The book of Job says that the earth has been given into the hand of the wicked, and he covereth the faces of the judges thereof. If not, where and who is he? The historic paper trail left by this group is very well documented, but ironically not common knowledge. This is because most of our trusted educational institutions were founded by the very same people who colonized the lands. This is important to understand because it isn't wise to let your enemy tell your story. So, how deep does this rabbit hole go? And how far-reaching are the tentacles of the Roman Catholic Mafia? Evidence shows that the people credited for establishing civilization in China were known as Li Men, or black-headed people, by the Zhou dynasty. The first dynasty was founded by King Sheng Tong, or Tong, a Negro man. He is the earliest documented ruler of the Xiang dynasty. This dynasty was credited with bringing together the elements of China's earliest civilization. It is also a documented fact that the Shang were referred to as the Naki by Sino-Tibetan cultures, Na meaning black and Ki denoting man. Books such as Naki Religion, an analytical appraisal of the Naki ritual text by Anthony Jackson, and African Presence in Early Asia by Ivan von Sertima and Renoko Rashidi elaborate on the presence of the so-called black people in the indigenous cultures and nobility of East Asia. One of the most legendary Chinese emperors, Fuxi, or Son of Heaven, is documented as being a woolly-haired black man who is credited as the author of I Ching, or the Book of Change, which is responsible for influencing some of the most known philosophers in East Asian history. There is also strong evidence to suggest that there is a black element in the Japanese population, particularly the population of South Japan. The Negroid element in Japan is clearly recognizable by the certain inhabitants with dark and often blackish skin, wide flat noses, and frizzy to curly hair. Bachelor points out in his book, Ainu, Light and Core, that the oldest known inhabitants of Japan are the Ainus. Alexander Francis Chamberlain, an anthropologist, published an essay entitled The Contribution of the Negro to Human Civilization. In it, he states, "And we can cross the whole of Asia and find the Negro again, for when, in far off Japan, the ancestors of the modern Japanese were making their way northward against the Ainu, the aborigines of that country. The leader of their army was Sakanoye Tamarammaro, a famous general and a Negro." So how did the Asians come to be viewed as yellow-skinned people, and how was power usurped from the original people?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Opium, in older times, was used for medicinal purposes. In the 17th century, the practice of mixing opium with tobacco for smoking spread from Southeast Asia, creating a far greater demand. As a means to stop the issue, a series of anti-opium edicts were issued from 1729 to 1831. In the book Mancus and Imperialism, the Qing Dynasty, from 1644 to 1900, it documents that about 400 chests were imported into China yearly. But during this time, imports continually increased, while smugglers and corrupt government officials sat back and profited off the opportunity. At the end of the 18th century, the East India Company noticed the profitability off of opium and began to expand their production in the Indian territory and sold to private vendors who would then sell the product to smugglers. Plug, middleman, dealer. Side note, the East India Company was an English and later British joint stock company founded in 1600 by John Watts, an English merchant and also a trustee of the Virginia Company, which is a company chartered by King James I on the 10th of April in 1606 with the object of colonizing the east coast of America, and Tom Smith, also an English merchant, politician, colonial administrator, and treasurer and de facto non-resident governor of the Virginia Company until his resignation in 1620. 2 years after Raleigh's execution, and 2 years before a major revolt caused by Smith's policies of rooting out the native people of America. The East India Company primarily operated trade in the Indian Ocean region, initially with the East Indies and later with East Asia. The company seized control of large parts of the Indian subcontinent, colonized parts of Southeast Asia and Hong Kong, and kept trading posts and colonies in the Persian Gulf residencies. At its peak, the company was the largest corporation in the world, competing with the Dutch East India Company, which is all under the same umbrella. The company even had its own armed force, totaling in about 260,000 soldiers. Originally chartered as Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, the company rose to account for half of the world trade during the mid-17 and early 1800s, particularly in basic commodities including cotton, silk, indigo, dye, sugar, salt, spices, tea, and opium. Getting back to the topic, by the time the Chinese authorities reissued the prohibition in 1799, the amount of imported chests of opium had leaped to 4,500 chests yearly, to the contrast of the 400 in 1729. The decade of the 1800s witnessed a rapid rise in opium trade up to 30,000 chests yearly. This effectively created an entire nation of drug addicts which the leaders of the Qing dynasty sought to eliminate. This ultimately resulted in 2 wars between the Western colonial powers and China. The First Opium War was fought from 1839 to 1842 between China and the British Empire. The Second Opium War took place between the years of 1856 and 1860 between China, Great Britain, France, and Russia. The European military defeated the Chinese, and as a result, the Chinese were forced into transferring Hong Kong to Great Britain, as well as granting the Western colonial powers favorable tariffs, land, and trade concessions. In 1856, the Qing Dynasty, Russian Empire, Second French Empire, United Kingdom, and the United States signed the Treaty of Tientsin, which is a collective name for several documents signed at Tianjin. These treaties, counted by the Chinese among the so-called unequal treaties, opened more Chinese ports to foreign trade, permitted foreign legation in the Chinese capital Beijing, allowed Christian missionary activity, and effectively legalized the import of opium. The Anu people of Japan foresaw the coming influence of the Roman Catholic Syndicate and its efforts to colonialize America, Europe, and India. The first attempt by Jesuits to reach East Asia was made in 1552 by Saint Francis Xavier, a Spanish priest, missionary, and founding member of the Society of Jesus. Xavier, however, died the same year on the Chinese island of Shangshuan without having reached the mainland. 3 decades later, in 1582, led by Matteo Ricci, Jesuits once again initiated mission work in China, ultimately introducing Western science, mathematics, astronomy, and visual arts to the imperial court, and carrying on significant intercultural and philosophical dialogue with Chinese scholars, particularly representatives of Confucianism. At the time of their peak influence in the 18th and 19th centuries, members of the Jesuit delegation were considered some of the emperor's most valued and trusted advisors, holding numerous prestigious posts in the imperial government. Many Chinese, including notable former Confucian scholars, adopted Christianity and became priests and members of the Society of Jesus. The Anu people were pushed farther and farther north until ultimately they were relegated almost entirely to the frigid island of Hokkaido. But in 1899, the Japanese government took inspiration from the treatment of the indigenous people in the American West. Under the Meiji Restoration, the Anu had their traditional lands taken from them, and their language and cultural practices were outlawed. The rich history of these Asiatic people was destroyed and then retold by the same people who colonized the land. In 1775, the 24 Histories, the first extensive presentation of Chinese official dynastic histories, was published. It was likely compiled by Sir Thomas Francis Wade, a British diplomat and sinologist who produced an early Chinese textbook in English in 1867. He was the first professor of Chinese at Cambridge University. After retiring from work over 40 years in the British embassies in China, he returned to England in 1883, and 3 years later donated 4,304 volumes of Chinese literature to the Cambridge University Library's Oriental Collection. A similar thing also happens in India. In 1784, the Asiatic Society of Bengal was founded by Warren Hastings, a British colonial administrator who led forces of the East India Company against a coalition of native states and the French. The society was created to supposedly collect and preserve the ancient manuscripts of India, as well as coins and inscriptions found in metal and stone. A few decades later, Friedrich Max Müller, a German philologist and Orientalist, became one of the founders of Western academic disciplines of Indian studies and religious studies. Müller was paid by the East India Company to translate the Vedas and to distort the original understanding, and to insert fallacious dates to further remove the people from their true history. Mentioned in the book, The Life and Letters of Friedrich Max Müller, published in 1902, is a letter written on December 9, 1867. In this letter, Müller wrote to his wife, "I feel convinced, though I shall not live to see it, that this edition of mine and the translation of the Veda will hereafter tell to a great extent on the fate of India, and on the growth of millions of souls in that country. It is the root of their religion, and to show them what root is, I feel sure the only way of uprooting all that has sprung from it during the last 3,000 years. The Mughal or Mughal Empire was the imperial power in the Indian subcontinent from about 1526 to 1757. The Mughal emperors were direct descendants of the Mongol Genghis Khan through Chagatai Khan and Timur. At the height of their powers in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, they controlled most of the subcontinent, extending from Bengal. In 1613, the first factory of the East India Company was set up in Surat. By 1757, the company waged war on the Nawab of Bengal after the decline of the Mughal Empire. They seized control of the entire state of Bengal. Over time, the state was overcome by war and famine. Then along comes Robert Clive, a British official who was appointed as the governor of Bengal. Clive drained the entire Bengal treasury onto over 100 boats and sent the fleet up the Ganges River to be given back to the Don, or to the crown. Clive also imposed taxes on the locals, which were used to purchase more goods from the Indians to send back to Albion, or England. So essentially, this resulted in the colonial powers taking their land, charging taxes, and then using that revenue to further create more financial instability in the land. To add a little historical context, the ancient Brahmins of Hindustan performed as teachers and gave instruction to their local elites who had not been completely Hindunized. These elites were accustomed to deference from local people, and they were offended by the Brahmins' posturing, pride, and arrogance. They resisted the claim of the Brahmins to higher rank and superior knowledge. Some of them opposed the bloodletting of Hinduism's animal sacrifices. Some of them also thought the Brahmins to be too involved in ceremonial formalities and rituals, and saw the Brahmins' view of gods and salvation as strange. As a result of this, the Nanda dynasty was overthrown by Chandragupta Maurya, who founded the Maurya Empire. He rapidly expanded his powers westward across central and western India, taking advantage of the disruptions of local powers in the wake of Alexander the Greek's armies heading west. This dynasty eventually became to be known as the Mughal Empire. The people originally known as the Brahmins migrated into the area we identify today as Abyssinia or Nubia. An example of the Brahmin culture meeting Ethiopia is the gymnosophist or the naked philosopher. This is the name given by the Greeks to certain ancient Indian philosophers who practiced self-denial to the point of regarding food and clothing as detrimental to purity of thought. Okay. They were also documented to be in Upper Egypt, where they were called Ethiopians by Apollonius of Tyana. This is why we see in certain interdisciplinary studies so many parallels between the Bible and Vedic beliefs. This can also be validated by the fact that the oldest Bible and the oldest traces of Christianity are found in Ethiopia. After a little more time, these people eventually migrate again and become known as the Nabateans or the Sabines. These are the people who are actually responsible for the founding of Rome as we know it today. This information is critical in understanding exactly why Ethiopia wasn't invaded during the colonialization of Africa. As mentioned earlier, Attorney Regis or the Eternal Crown created the Crown of Aragon or the Crown of Spain. This was a composite monarchy under the supervision of the Pope. Ethiopia's contact with Christian Europe increased during the reign of Emperor Zara Yacob, who died in 1468. Known for his statecraft, Zara Yacob also reformed the Ethiopian church and lent his support to its monastic and missionary efforts. Invited by Pope Eugene IV to fully unite with the Catholic Church, Tsar Jacob sent a delegation of clergy to Florence, where in 1439 a council was held to discuss the reunification of various Eastern churches with Rome. There has always been some speculation that modern Ethiopians have some form of a genealogical connection with Italians. Based off the information just presented, that assumption isn't completely off basis. According to Benito Sylvain, a Haitian journalist, diplomat, lawyer, and pioneer of Pan-Africanism, he stated that in his meeting with King Menelik II, that when asked to join the NAACP, Menelik rejected the offer off of the basis that he self-identified as Caucasian. It is also speculated that Tafari Makonnen, better known as Haile Selassie, was of the royal house of Savoy. The scramble for Africa is one of the most misunderstood periods in world history. The first European colonies in Africa were established by the Portuguese. These factories were set up as strategical bases to help expand their trade in India. This was common practice at the time, as we see evidence of the East India Company establishing bases throughout East Asia and India as well. In 1650, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain. This resulted in the Portuguese entering into Spain's war with the Dutch and English. This is the point in history when the Dutch enter into the colonial conquest of Africa. The Dutch then took Mina from the Portuguese, established the Dutch slave coast, and took over the Star Forts in Senegal. In the 1500s, the Adal Sultanate attempted to conquer Abyssinia. Ironically, the Portuguese came to aid their fellow brothers of the crown. This prompted the Ottoman Empire to assist the Adal Sultanate, which sparked the Ottoman-Portuguese conflicts from 1538 to 1559. This conflict spread from East Africa all the way to Hindustan, or India. See the correlation? In North Africa, the Portuguese attempted to conquer Morocco multiple times and were fairly unsuccessful, although they were able to establish a few bases along the coast. However, in 1662, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married Charles II of England. As part of the dowry, she gave England Tangier in Morocco. This could have set England up to expand into North Africa, but the English Protestants believed Charles to be a Catholic, so as a result, they had all the fortifications destroyed. In the 1500s, the Spaniards were able to conquer many cities along the northern coast of Africa, such as Tripoli in 1510. They also were able to conquer the city of Algiers, as well as Tunis. The Spanish Empire then gave these cities over to the Knights of St. John in Malta. All of this plus a lot more resulted in the Berlin Conference of 1885, also known as the Congo Conference. This conference regulated European colonialization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period and coincided with Germany's sudden emergence as an imperial power. The conference was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of Germany. The concept of state formation was imposed onto Africa at this point. Prior to the conference, European diplomats approached governments in Africa in the same manner as they did in Asia, India, and the Western Hemisphere, by establishing a connection to local trade networks. Similar to the East India Company or the Virginia Company in America, the Crown also set up the English African Company of Merchants and the Guinea Company. In 1876, King Leopold II of Belgium, who had founded and controlled the International African Association the same year, invited Henry Morton Stanley to join him in researching and civilizing the continent. In 1878, the International Congo Society was also formed, with more economic goals, but still closely related to the former society. Leopold secretly bought off the foreign investors in the Congo Society, which was turned into its imperialistic goals, with the African Society serving primarily as a philanthropic front. The global power elite has its roots in the Roman Empire. Although it may seem that the European powers have competed with each other throughout history, in reality they have all been working together on behalf of the secret hand. Portugal, Spain, Britain, the Netherlands, Italy, and Venice all work individually on behalf of the Don Dada himself. In 1452, the Papal Bull Dum Diversas was issued by Nicholas V. It authorized the conquering of all Saracens and pagans and subjected them into perpetual servitude. This, along with many other things, essentially sparked the Protestant Reformation of 1517. All those who opposed the church were either killed or fled to the home of the Protestant movement, Germania. The Germans, being the forerunners of rebelling against the crown, held back the influence of the church longer than most European nations, but eventually too fell victim. This was probably the last major opposing power in Europe to go against the crown. This is also why the perception of German imperialism is shown in a negative light. Germania's role in imperialism was essentially to ensure that the colonial powers were kept in check. Proof of this unspoken notion is in the Peace of Westphalia. This is a collective name for two peace treaties. They ended the 30 Years' War in 1618 from 1648, and the 80 Years' War from 1568 to 1648, and brought peace to the Holy Roman Empire, closing a period of European history that killed somewhere up to 8 million people. The Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand III of Habsburg, the Spanish monarchy, the kingdoms of France and Sweden, the Netherlands, and their respective allies among the princes of the Holy Roman Empire participated in these treaties. This peace, however, did not last long, but not at the fault of the Germans. After the orchestration of World War I, the colonial powers divided the German colonies amongst themselves. All of these wars, instigated by the church, decimated the original families of Europe, essentially creating a power vacuum that was filled by the new families appointed by the crown. For an example, the Orange Nassau and the Hohenzollern families held seats of power in the Netherlands, Britain, the German Empire, and even had seats among the Russian Tsars. Speaking of the Tsars, the empire was infiltrated in 1757 under Peter the Great, another Swarthian. Peter was a monarch of the Tsardom of Russia and later the Russian Empire from 1682 until his death in 1725. Under his reign, Russia was modernized and grew into a European power. Under Peter's leadership, the Tsardom of Rus became mainstream. Peter ended up losing the support of the Russian clergy over his reforms. Local hierarchs became very suspicious of Peter's friendship with foreigners. He required that the nobility conform more to Western standards such as shaving their beards. Under his rule, he also brought the orthodoxy under the state control. You also have the Habsburgs, an Austrian-Spanish dynasty, which was once the most prominent royal family of Europe in the 15th to the 20th century. Prominent members of this family are the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Charles II of Spain, and many more. They were funded by the Fokker family, a German banking family that replaced the infamous Medici family. The Fuggers assisted the Habsburgs in their conquest of the known world today. As we can see, the reach of the Roman Catholic Mafia is wide, and their means of accomplishing their ultimate goal has no limit. That leaves us with one more place to discuss.